Chapter 7. Entangled Strings. Only in the last moment in history has the delusion arisen that people can flourish apart from the rest of the living world. E.O. Wilson. In the early 1900s, I was in Toronto, Canada. I went to see my doctor because I felt tired and listless. He sent me to have an electrocardiogram. Later that day, when he got the results back, he told me that my heart was at serious risk. He told me to stay calm, not exert myself, keep nitroglycerin pills with me at all times, and to not go outside alone. The doctors administered several tests over the course of the following 3 days, and I failed them all because my arteries were severely clogged. They included an angiogram, another electrocardiogram, and a treadmill stress test. When I started the bicycle test, the clinic staff didn't even let me finish. They stopped me part way. They were afraid I was going to die on the spot. My arteries were so clogged. As a high-risk patient, I was given an immediate appointment for heart bypass surgery. The day before the surgery, I woke up feeling much better. I went to the hospital. I was given an angiogram, and this involved shooting dye into my arteries through an injection in my thigh. The surgeons wanted to discover the exact location of the blockages prior to the operation. I was prepared for surgery. My chest was shaved, and the doctors were about to mark my skin where they planned to make the incision. When the new angiograms came back from the lab, the doctor in charge looked at them. He became very upset. He said he had wasted his time. There were no blockages visible at all. He said he wished his own arteries looked as clear, and he could not explain why all the other tests had shown such severe problems. I later discovered that my friend Loren Smith, a Pomo Indian medicine man in California, upon hearing of my heart trouble, had assembled a group of his students for a healing ceremony the day before the second angiogram. He covered one man with bay leaves and told him that his name was Richard Geggy. For the next hour, Loren led the group in songs, prayers, and movement. The next day, I was healed. I have seen Loren facilitate other amazing healings. Sometimes he works in a trance, invoking his grandfather, Tom Smith, who was a very famous healer. When he emerges from trance, he's unable to remember what he has said. The story was told by former cardiac patient Richard Geggy for the book The Heart of Healing. Some 15 years later, Geggy is still in excellent health. It is by no means an isolated example of distant healing. There are impressive databases dedicated to cataloging studies of the phenomenon. 2 careful studies of terminally ill AIDS patients by Elizabeth Targ, MD, PhD, showed similar results. The patients in her experimental group were offered remote healing by 40 religious and spiritual healers. Some were evangelical Christians, and some were traditional Catholics. Some were Buddhist, and some were independent faith healers. One was a Jewish Kabbalist, another a Lakota Sioux shaman, and another was a Chinese Qigong master. After going through elaborate precautions to ensure that no one in the study could know which patients were being prayed for, the healers were sent an envelope containing a patient's photo, name, and helper T-cell count. 6 months later, the researchers found that those who had received remote healing showed improved mood, significantly fewer doctor visits, fewer hospitalizations, fewer days in the hospital, improved helper T-cell counts, fewer new AIDS-defining illnesses, and significantly lower quantities of the HIV virus in their systems. The results of this study of healing at a distance are not unusual. Researchers have conducted several meta-analyses of distant healing research. Most studies found results far in excess of what might be explained by chance. Electromagnetic signaling explains many healing phenomena that cannot be explained by other medical models. The semiconductive properties of connective tissue explains others. However, healing at a distance or non-local healing cannot be explained by other mechanisms. How is it possible for healing to occur when the person receiving the healing is too far away from the person offering the healing to be affected by the healer's electromagnetic fields? Quantum physics and string theory offer us some intriguing insights as to how this might occur. Subatomic Alchemy. In 1907, a pioneering physicist, Ernest Rutherford of the University of Manchester, discovered that the atom could be subdivided into a nucleus of protons and neutrons, surrounded by an orbit of electrons. He showed that virtually the entire volume of an atom was empty space, rather than the solid substance conceived of in Newtonian physics, and that most of the atom's mass was concentrated at the nucleus. He also demonstrated that electrons were bound to the nucleus by an electromagnetic field. So enamored was he of his profession that he declared, "In science there is only physics. All the rest is stamp collecting." For the ensuing century, medicine repaid the compliment by ignoring the discoveries and implications of quantum theory for healing. And by the start of the 21st century, physicists had catalogued dozens of subatomic particles, and among them baryons, pentaquarks, mesons, leptons, axions, neutrinos, muons, and bosons. Many particles have characteristics that challenge our perception of linear time and orderly space by manifesting into existence, then disappearing again only to repeat the cycle. We have observed matter vanishing into energy, then winking back in somewhere else as a different type of particle. Even when more unsettling and rather than fixed realities, these energies exist in the form of an infinite set of possibilities, a possibility wave out of which probabilities emerge. Quantum physics can calculate a range of possible events for electrons and the possibility of these possible events, but cannot predict the unique actual event that a particular measurement will precipitate. Theoretically, any of the swarm of infinite possibilities present in the possibility wave can become reality, but only one does. The swarm is then said to have collapsed into a particular reality. One of the factors that determine the direction in which the swarm of possibilities collapses is the act of observation. In a quantum universe, phenomena and space and time are affected by the observer. All possibilities exist in the quantum field. The act of observation collapses them into probability. In the realm of probability, says quantum physicist Amit Goswami, Ph.D., the electron is not separate from us, from consciousness. It is a possibility of consciousness itself, a material possibility. When consciousness collapses the possibility wave by choosing one of the electron's possible facets, that facet becomes actuality. So the scientific mind, rather than impartially witnessing objective phenomena, is itself influencing which of the infinite sea of potential winks into existence as a phenomenon. Goswami continues, the agency that transforms possibility into actuality is consciousness. It is a fact that whenever we observe an object, we see a unique actuality, not the entire spectrum of possibilities. Thus, conscious observation is sufficient condition for the collapse of the possibility wave. This is called the observer effect. Though first observed in physics, it holds true in other disciplines. Douglas Yeoman and Noel McInnes remind us in the book Einstein's Business that a major scientific precedent for managing our outcomes was set by quantum physicists who, when seeking to determine whether light consists of particles or waves, discovered that light invariably behaves in compliance with their experimental expectations. Light always and only behaves like waves in experiments designed to detect waves, yet just as consistently shows up as particles in the experiments that were designed to detect particles. In both cases, experimental outcomes conform to the experimenter's expectations. Physicist Werner Heisenberg said, "What we observe is not nature itself, but nature exposed to our method of questioning." In The Intention Experiment, her book about a large international experiment underway to gauge the effect of human intention on physical matter, Lynn McTaggart says that the observer effect implies that living consciousness is somehow central to this process of transforming the unconstructed quantum world into something resembling everyday reality, and that reality is not fixed, but fluid, and hence possibly open to influence. A gifted faith healer might be considered, in quantum terms, to be an observer who routinely collapses space-time possibilities into the probability of healing. A prayer is an intention that might also collapse the swarm of possibilities present in the possibility wave in the direction of a certain probability. Such quantum phenomena are not limited by geography or history. Einstein said that the distinction between the past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion. Hundreds of experiments have shown the effect of an observer on material reality. A particularly charming and visual demonstration of the effect of intent was done by René Picard, M.D. He used a self-propelled robot he called a psychoscope, which contained a random number generator. He monitored its movements on a plotter, and when it was put in a room, the plotter, tracking the robot's movements, found that it indeed moved around the room in an entirely arbitrary way, at random angles and for random lengths of time. He then introduced a cage of chicks at one end of the room. The chicks had been trained to relate to the psychoscope as though it were the mother hen. In the presence of the chick's intention, the robot's movements were no longer random. It approached the cage of chicks 2.5 times more often than it would approach an empty cage. Another possible explanation for distant healing comes from string theory. String theory explains phenomena like electron tunneling. Tunneling is a misleading term, since it implies that electrons travel through a tunnel, but in fact they don't. Electrons in a field have been observed to jump from one orbit to another orbit without traveling through the intervening space, and without any time having elapsed. They disappear in one orbit and simultaneously reappear in another orbit. Physicist Niels Bohr was the first to describe such a quantum leap. One researcher describes tunneling this way. Suppose that you fire a particle such as a proton or electron at some kind of wall that it doesn't have enough energy to penetrate. Occasionally the particle will appear to tunnel straight through. what would otherwise be an impassable obstacle, just by happening to jump from one part of its probability wave to another. How can an electron jump from one spot to another without going through the space between the 2 points, and without taking any time to complete the process? Even Albert Einstein was baffled by this phenomenon. String theory solves that problem by postulating an 11-dimension multiverse. Electrons may jump out of one existence in our universe into another, and then reappear in our universe. The tunnel through which the electrons pass exists in another universe within the multiverse, and is not subject to the rules of space and time that govern the limited number of dimensions of which we are aware. String theory also explains how subatomic particles can demonstrate both the properties of a particle and of a wave. We are accustomed to thinking of things as either a particle, a solid object, or a wave, a vibration. Yet light and many subatomic particles can effortlessly manifest as either a wave or a particle. According to string theory, everything in the universe is made up of tiny vibrating strings, and these strings are identical. The reason that one manifests as a heavy particle, like a proton, and another as a particle without mass, like light, is that they vibrate at different frequencies. According to Einstein's famous equation, E equals mc squared, the more energy something has, the more mass it has. So a heavy particle is a string vibrating at a high frequency, whereas a light particle, light in both senses of the word, is a string vibrating at a lower frequency. Strings are also very small. If the image of an atom illustrated at the start of this section was magnified to the size of our solar system, a string would be the size of a tree. The 11th dimension is the dimension that may contain within it, in the words of one BBC reporter, any number of parallel universes. Physicists say that this dimension may be only a millimeter away from us, yet we have no awareness of its existence. This is because the other universes are vibrating out of phase with ours, at a frequency that we cannot perceive. There's vastly more mass in our universe than we can perceive, and this missing mass, some 96% of the total, is thought to consist of dark energy and dark matter, terms which, according to Scientific American, serve mainly as expressions of our ignorance, much as the marking of an early map with terra incognita. This dark matter and dark energy may be manifestations of the parallel universes. The alternative universes postulated by string theory are like pieces of paper stacked one on top of the other, and each vibrates at a slightly different rate, so we cannot perceive them. As the vibrational rate of a string changes, it may jump out of phase in our universe, into phase in another, and then back into phase in ours. As the string resonates at a particular frequency, it produces subatomic particles. Each resonance is associated with a particular particle. As the vibrational frequency of the string changes, it expresses as different subatomic particles. Like the tunneling electron, these particles can flash into existence in our universe, then flash into another universe, and then flash back into ours. In this way, signals can pass between dimensions. Discomfort and novelty in research. When looking for explanations of how the world works, we're historically much more comfortable with solid objects, particles, like the ion transfer theory of classical neurology, or the use of drugs and chemotherapy to treat disease. We are less comfortable with intangible phenomena, waves, like electromagnetic signaling, or the effects of consciousness and energy healing on disease. String theory rattles our cage stretches our minds and reminds us that healing can occur in dimensions that are outside of our known universe, let alone our comfort zone. Physicist Michio Kaku, one of the originators of string theory, compares us to a fish swimming with other fishes in a shallow pond. This fish has explored every facet of the two-dimensional universe that it inhabits. Then someone yanks the fish from the pond and lifts it high above the pond. Suddenly, the fish experiences a third dimension, up, of which it was previously unaware. It comes back to the pond and tries to explain the remarkable perspective from which it has just seen the world. The other fish are baffled. That state of bafflement is common when we attempt to stretch our space-time delimited minds around the complexities of quantum physics and string theory. Yet they may explain phenomena such as distant healing, which we know occur, but which current medical models, bound as they are to the pond in which we swim, cannot explain or comprehend, even with the aid of electromagnetism and rapid connective tissue signaling. Intentions can have measurable physical effects on matter down to the subatomic level. Dean Radin, Ph.D., senior scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences in Petaluma, California, designed an ingenious experiment to determine this. He placed a low-intensity laser beam inside a shielded room, which blocks out all electromagnetic radiation, and research subjects were asked to intuitively perceive the laser light, and either block it or let it flow freely for 30 seconds. He found perturbations in the laser corresponding to blocking sessions, and no perturbations when the intention was free-flowing. Another research group at Princeton's PEAR lab looked at the effect of intention on random number generators. Such generators produce, by definition, the random series of numbers, and should continue doing so under all conditions, since they're not hooked up to any other device and are usually shielded from electromagnetic radiation and other sources of interference with the machine's function. When analyzing a large number of trials, however, the Princeton researchers found that intention could produce anomalies in the series of random numbers, resulting in spikes of non-randomness. Now, the implication of this research is that your intentions are affecting the matter around you to some degree, be it ever so slight, and since you may be busy intending this or that outcome for more than 30 seconds per day, your cumulative intentions might indeed push your destiny in one direction or another. A fascinating example of consciousness, seeing something that could not be perceived without the physical senses, comes from accounts of NDEs, or near-death experiences. NDEs involve people who die physically and are then revived, and they often report floating above the operating table or hospital, traveling down a tunnel of light in which they encounter loved ones who died earlier, and then finally returning to their bodies. Of particular interest are accounts of patients who are blind. Vicky Noratuk, blind at birth, accurately saw her body, including being able to describe her wedding ring during an NDE in which she saw, for the first time in her life. It seems that consciousness has means of perception even when our senses fail us. Whereas electromagnetic fields are a mechanism of biological signaling implicated in healing, they cannot explain healing at a distance. Radin performed an ingenious experiment to illustrate this phenomenon by placing the receivers of healing in a shielded room designed specifically to block out all electromagnetic radiation. Even the cables running into the room to monitor the equipment are fiber optic instead of metal wires. The healees were cancer patients, and the healers were their spouses or close friends. The healthy person sent healing intention to the cancer patient in the Faraday cage in 10-second bursts. These periods were selected at random by a computer, and the researchers measured the skin conductance of those receiving healing. During the healing burst, the skin conductive of the healees increased, indicating activation of the autonomic nervous system. This and similar studies indicate that we have to look beyond local efforts like electromagnetism to explain distant healing and find quantum answers. While you may be sick in this dimension, you may be the model of health in another dimension of the multiverse. Your intention in this dimension, acting in a quantum field, may collapse the swarm of possibilities in such a way as to influence health. Such ideas stretch the boundaries of our imagination, yet they hark back to shamanic journeys or aboriginal walkabouts in the dream time, into which our ancestors traveled to find cures. Jean Houston, Ph.D., suspects that healers can identify with archetypes that have the capacity to bring larger patterns of possibility, evolutionary cadences, and a wider spectrum of reality into conscious knowledge and experience. She speculates that instantaneous healing may be a consequence of a healer dissolving his or her local self and being filled with an archetypical or sacred image. Archetypal space-time may also contain the optimum template of a person's health and well-being. The job of the healer is to call that template back into consciousness so that it can work upon a malfunctioning body or mind. An entangled universe. Another characteristic of quantum theory is entanglement, the idea that relationship is the defining characteristic of everything in space and time. The concept of entanglement arose from the observation by physicists that certain particles still appear to move in a connected fashion, without any time lag, even after they are separated by large amounts of space. In his book, Entangled Minds, Radin quotes Erwin Schrödinger, one of the early proponents of quantum theory and the originator of the name entanglement, as saying, "I would not call entanglement one, but rather the characteristic trait of quantum mechanics. Not only does atomic matter become entangled, whole systems may become entangled too." Radin quotes a March 2004 review of the research into entanglement by New Scientist magazine. It concludes that physicists now believe that entanglement between particles exists everywhere, all the time, and have recently found shocking evidence that it affects the wider, macroscopic world that we inhabit. Given the pervasive nature of the entanglement of atomic particles, it is unlikely that evolution has ignored this basic characteristic of matter in setting up human systems, having realized that some form of epigenetic control is required to produce the complex orchestration of living systems. Entanglement is a good place to look for the mechanisms of cybernetic control. According to a researcher at the Vienna University of Technology, entanglement could coordinate biochemical reactions in different parts of a cell, or in different parts of an organ. It could allow correlated firings of distant neurons, and it could coordinate the behavior of members of a species, because it is independent of distance and requires no physical link. British physicist David Bohm observed that entanglement applies even more to consciousness, that its constant flow of evanescent thoughts, feelings, urges, desires, and impulses, all of these flow into and out of each other. Thus, entanglement offers a tantalizing glimpse into how distant intention and intercessory prayer might operate to produce healing even at great distances. Dr. Robin Kelly, a British physician, has accumulated much of the research on the properties of microtubules, the tiny cylindrical protein girders in our cells described in Chapter 5. In his fascinating book, The Human Antenna, since they are resonant structures, he asks with what signal are they resonating, and he speculates that they receive signals from the quantum field, and play a role in the communication between one cell and another, and between all cells and the quantum field. Brain cells contain very high concentrations of microtubules. Kelly describes the insights in the early 1990s of British physicist Sir Roger Penrose and American anaesthetist Stuart Hameroff into the purpose of the microtubules. Sir Roger speculated that microtubules might be sophisticated computers processing information gleaned from the quantum world. They hypothesized that these tiny hollow spirals might function as antennae, linking the time and space-bound cells of our bodies to the infinite and timeless world of quantum space. Kelly suspects that microtubules may be the physical structures through which intention and consciousness can be transmitted across great distances. The first experimental evidence of telepathy between one strand of DNA and another comes from a 2008 article in the Journal of Physical Chemistry. In it, researchers reported that DNA strands that had no contact with each other or with proteins that could facilitate their communication were able to recognize similarities with other DNA strands from a distance, and then congregate together. Identical strands were twice as likely to associate with each other as with strands with different molecular sequences. The researchers had no explanation for the mechanism by which such a phenomenon might occur, even though they were able to observe its existence. The mirror in your brain. One of the most exciting new areas of brain research is the field of mirror neurons. Mirror neurons are neurons that fire in our brains when we witness an act done by another that requires the same group of neurons. When the neurons in the other person's brain fire and that person performs the action, the neurons in our brains fire in sympathy. When another person puts on a hat, for instance, the neurons in our brains that govern that action fire when we witness their action, just as the other person's neurons do when they perform it. This whole process happens without going through the normal sensory cognitive cycle that conventional brain models would suggest. Visual images passing from the optic nerve as our eyes witness the other person performing the action, then to the visual cortex, then to the parts of the brain that govern decision making, and eventually being translated into signals sent via the nervous system. Now, the first researchers to describe this phenomenon were a team of Italian scientists at the University of Parma led by Giacomo Rizzolotti. They are studying the brain patterns of macaque monkeys, in particular the premotor cortex, which plans and initiates movements, which then travel to the muscles via the nerves. The researchers identified which brain cells became active when a monkey picked up a nut. However, one of the researchers inadvertently picked up his own nut while a monkey was still attached to the brain scanner. Much to the surprise of the scientists, the same area of the brain became active in the monkey while observing the researchers' actions. Now, this initial discovery in 1995 led the team to find many other groups of neurons that mirror the actions of others. Researchers at many sites are now investigating the properties of mirror neurons. An early clinical application was the study of autism. Researchers at the University of San Diego, led by Villanueva Ramanachiran, suspected that autistic children might not be picking up the same cues from the actions of others when they compared a group of autistic children with a control group. They discovered that indeed the autistic group did not register mirror neuron activity. Albert Einstein and other scientists proposed in 1935 that non-local action was a requirement of quantum mechanics, the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen paradox, but it was not verified experimentally until much later. To find out if quantum entanglement also occurs between human beings, Dean Radin designed and conducted an innovative study. He had two people meditate, sitting side by side in an electromagnetically shielded room, working on the hypothesis that group meditation might induce entanglement. After a time, one of the subjects was moved to a second shielded room about 15 yards away and hooked up to an EEG machine. Then a light was shone at irregular intervals into the eyes of the meditator in the first room, who was also hooked up to an EEG. The EEG readings were later compared, and the periods in which the brain of the person into whose eyes the light was shown recorded changes in the EEG pattern were noted and compared to the EEG readouts from the person who had been moved to the second Faraday cage, as well as to the readouts for the control group. The researchers found that at that precise moment when the light was shown into one meditator's eyes, the brain of the other meditator responded, while the brains of the control group demonstrated no such effect. They concluded that a human brain is capable of establishing non-local relationships with other brains, even when sensory communication, electromagnetic signals, and other cues have been ruled out. Such links between the consciousness of one person and another require quantum signaling. And up to this point, researchers have assumed that mirror neurons fire when an action is visually observed. It would be intriguing to test whether mirror neurons fire simultaneously in the observer and the observed. Such linkage might be routine in an entangled universe in which distant particles change orbits simultaneously. Though the possibilities for healing opened up, such quantum signaling might be immense. The medical mainstream has little time for them. Orthodoxies die hard, and one of the world's top medical journals, The Lancet, laid out the current medical position in 2005. Nothing in our contemporary scientific views of the universe or consciousness can account for how the healing intentions or prayers of distant intercessors could possibly influence the physiology of patients, even nearby, let alone at a great distance. Such bastions of conventional medicine have somehow overlooked the discovery of electricity, magnetism, quantum fields, epigenetics, and several thousand scientific studies. And the great German physicist Max Planck observed, "Science advances one funeral at a time. As older dogmatists die off and new people enter the profession." These quantum entanglements may bind human beings together in surprising ways. They may explain phenomena such as synchronistic events. Marie-Louise von Franz wrote Darwin had developed his theory in a lengthy essay, and in 1844 was busy expanding this into a major treatise, when he received a manuscript from a young biologist unknown to him. The man was A. R. Wallace, whose manuscript was a shorter but otherwise parallel exposition of Darwin's theory at the time. Wallace was in the Maluku Islands of the Malay Archipelago, and he knew of Darwin as a naturalist, but had not the slightest idea of the kind of theoretical work on which Darwin was at the time engaged. In each case, a creative scientist had independently arrived at a hypothesis that was to change the entire development of biological science. Backed up later by documentary evidence, each had initially conceived of the hypotheses as an intuitive flash. The number of joint Nobel Prizes often awarded to researchers who have had no contact with each other testifies that entanglement did not start or end in the 19th century. Near the beginning of the 20th century, a British mathematician and physicist, Sir James Jeans, persistently observed, "When we view ourselves in space and time, our consciousnesses are obviously the separate individuals of a particle picture. But when we pass beyond space and time, they may perhaps form ingredients of a single continuous stream of life. As it is with light and electricity, so it may be with life, and the phenomena may be individuals carrying on separate existences in space and time, while in the deeper reality beyond space and time, we may all be members of one body."